Gingerwalla, welcome to Mundine's Truth Talking. I'm Nyungai Warren Mundine, author, businessman and business advisor, advocate for Indigenous Australia. I'm an Aboriginal, I'm an Australian of Bundjalung, Yuin, Gumbenga and Irish descent. Through these webinars, I've been bringing Indigenous business people and advocates together to engage in some truth talking. Tonight, we'll be talking about a very tough issue, but it's one we need to talk about. A recent Northern Territory coroner's inquest into the deaths of 3 Aboriginal children has heard shocking testimony of abuse, neglect, and failures by the agencies who were supposed to protect them. This included cases of 3 teenage Aboriginal girls who were molested and raped in childhood and were all found dead in apparent suicides within a year in 2016 and 2017. All lived in remote Northern Territory and were sexually assaulted before deaths. The inquest has heard investigations were badly bungled by police, so much so the coroner warned that the whole truth about their deaths may never be known. This inquest is yet another in a long line of inquiries and reports that tell us Indigenous children are being abused and let down nationwide. Offences not reported or investigated properly. Communities are protecting perpetrators but not children. Child abuse normalised. Community leaders and authorities failing to deal with sexual abuse of Indigenous children. Children are dying. These Black lives matter too. Will this inquest be yet another inquiry that gathers dust? Why don't communities and governments have the courage to address it? And what the hell is going on in the Northern Territory? With me tonight is one of Australia's most passionate advocates for Indigenous children in Australia, Jacinta Price, Director of the Indigenous Programs at the Centre for Independent Studies and the Deputy Mayor of Alice Springs. Jacinta is a long-time campaigner against domestic violence and violence in Indigenous communities, all communities. Jacinta is a Warlpiri and Celtic Australian woman from Alice Springs. Jacinta, can you give us some understanding of what this coroner's inquest is about and what you have heard?
So there have recently been a couple of inquests. The one inquest concerning 3 teenage girls in 2000, their suicides took place in 2016, and they were between the ages of 15 and 17. They were from top-end communities, and the police had decided that they had been suicides despite the fact that 2 of them had suffered injuries consistent with sexual assault the day that they died. And the other had fresh facial injuries. And they'd all been raped. One of them had been raped probably by three times by 3 different males when she was 12 years old. And as a result, her family got her onto contraception. So if you think about it, because you become a rape victim, the best your family can do is then put you on a contraceptive to ensure that if there's ongoing rape, you aren't impregnated. That speaks volumes about the need for families to understand how to better support victims of abuse. And, unfortunately, I believe in many of these communities, it's almost like become a norm. I don't know many Indigenous people in remote communities in particular, but not just in remote communities, but who haven't actually experienced sexual abuse or assault at some stage in their lives. Now, another one of those girls was also beaten by her one of her own aunts to the point where she miscarried in her life at some stage in her teenage years. One had been diagnosed with an STI when she was just 13 years old, but Territory families stated that nothing was done because there was no evidence that the male involved was significantly older. So, you know, basically it's like there's a standard going on. So if there's an older male involved and this you know, young person gets an STI, then we'll act. You know, well, we don't even know if that's going to happen by the looks of this particular inquiry. But what you have to ask also is that, okay, so she might be 13 and with an STI, but is it okay for the average Australian child at the age of 13 to have an STI? I mean, between 2006 and 2016, the numbers of cases of childhood STIs for Aboriginal kids skyrocketed 180%. And, you know, there are some Indigenous leaders who have argued that you can't conflate the issue of young people and STIs and assume that it's always to do with sexual abuse. Well, once again, if we consider average Australians in the suburbs of, I'm here in Brisbane, regular everyday Australians in the suburbs of their communities, if we saw these rates of STIs among children, because they are children, they're under the ages of 16, they're under the ages of 18, then you would think that you should hold some grave and very deep concerns for these children and not try to make excuses for them. In 2016, Aboriginal girls were 60 times more likely to contract syphilis. These are the crimes that are going on every day under our noses in this country, and issues that, you know, movements like the Black Lives Matter movement want to choose to completely and utterly ignore. And, we're concerned about, to be honest, I really couldn't give a rat's about changing lyrics to our anthem, or ensuring that our flag is being flown in Parliament House during NAIDOC week. I would rather just, choose to deal with these particular issues that our children are faced with, the very reasons why we're seeing them suicide. Amongst Aboriginal Australians, the fifth biggest killer of Aboriginal Australians is suicide, and our children are disproportionately affected by suicide in comparison to the rest of Australia. And it's just not good enough. One, that families don't know how to support these kids, but that when families do fail these kids, that government departments are certainly not stepping up and protecting these children.
Well, you look at it and you got to say, look, we don't tolerate that, like you said, in the suburbs of Brisbane or Sydney or even Dubbo or other places around the country, Perth and that. I just find this, totally amazing that the forces that be, the people who are supposed to be looking after these kids, keeping them safe, people who are in charge of these areas, and we just hear report after report after report after report. We've had so many reports. What the hell is going on? Why do we tolerate it in the Northern Territory Aboriginal communities? And of course, the greater question is, why do we tolerate it anywhere? Actually,
absolutely. And I don't know how much evidence has to be thrown into our faces for us to understand that there is a crisis going on, that there is an urgency here. I mean, this is decades worth of issues that continue to just pile up in a corner and continue to be ignored. And, you know, I think in places like the Northern Territory, I think it's very much these communities are out of sight and out of mind to the average Australian. The mainstream media are certainly not at all interested in it. And if they do show an interest, then you see the elites come forward with threats of defamation or suing, TV programs that suggest that there are women and children being raped in remote communities. You know, people like Kerry-Anne Kennelly get told that they're racist for speaking these truths, and there's a push to silence, to shut people up, which is really, really profoundly disturbing. And because of that push and the threat and the fear, threat of legal action, the threat of being called racist, the threat of being cancelled in this contemporary cancel culture stops anyone from outside looking in, wanting to do something or bring these issues up or address them, stops them from doing so. I mean, you know, there are some TV programs that I go on, and I'm reminded prior to the program, you know, for legal purposes, please ensure that you don't specify a particular community or mention particular names, because there are big heroes out there, social justice warriors out there, who are waiting to pounce because they are somehow offended because they claim Aboriginality, and therefore it is their right to be offended when we talk about the issue of STIs amongst 16-year-olds, the issue of teenagers, kids being raped and suiciding as a result of the continued abuse that these kids are suffering. I mean, who are we trying to protect here? Who are we trying to protect? And well, not we, because I know I'm certainly not trying to shoot down any messenger who is prepared to crack open these issues and air them out. I mean, you know, we in Western society, which a lot of these privileged elite folk, you know, take advantage of, this Western society that is there to support them and their way of life, they also use that privilege to try and shut down this conversation and this level of debate. And we all know the name of George Floyd. He's been held up as this hero, and yet the names of, we just recently heard that the mother of Annalise Ugal, she wants her daughter's name heard. She's the 11 years old, who took her own life at the thought of her perpetrator being given bail and being out in the community. It should be her name we should be shouting from the rooftops and from the streets, and we should be marching in order to hold up the rights of children exactly like her and supporting those families. But the problem is, a lot of these offenders are some of the elders of these communities, as we have learned recently in terms of some of the recent cases in Western Australia. And so not only have we got cases of shooting, you know, trying to shoot the messenger, any mainstream media who try to bring this subject up get threatened with court action by the Human Rights Commission. Mind you, human rights, they're really concerned with children's human rights here, because they would solicit offended Aboriginal people's complaints in order to shoot down these supposed racist white people who talk about this issue. But not only do we have that, but we've also got the bullies in these communities who are threatening victims' families to ensure that they don't speak out about these particular issues. I mean, we've got to be able to protect the vulnerable so they have the opportunity to speak out about what is going on to them, to their loved ones, to their children, within their communities. That is an absolute must. The cycles have to be broken, and we're just not getting there yet.
Well, welcome to Mundine's Truth Talking, and we'd like to say thanks to the Good Source News for hosting the live stream tonight. If you want news and opinions you can trust and media not compromised by anti-everything narratives, you want the Good Source. Go to the Good Source News to hear from some of the best conservative thinkers in Australia and New Zealand, to hear independent voices on a free speech platform. Now, I just get really, really angry when I hear these things, because they've been going on for decades and decades and decades, and all you hear from these people, and then I actually challenge the leadership of the Black Lives Matter movement. I challenge the leadership that's out there, the coalition of the peaks, to actually come out and campaign against the violence that's been happening against Aboriginal children and women in these communities. We had even men who have been violently treated in these. And it's not only talking about the Northern Territory. It's across Australia, and we know that's across Australia. We know the names of all these people who had the Black Deaths in custody. But what about the innocents? What about the poor people, the kids of our society that have been treated in this horrible way? Now, you look at the Royal Commission that was called by the Prime Minister at the time, Malcolm Turnbull, within half an hour into Dondale and correctional system. Well, where's the Royal Commission into this? Where's the Royal Commission into the treatment of these children and what has happened to them? Because you just got to say, what, as you said, Jacinta, what do you say? When you just hear this over and over and over again, and then at the end of the day, nothing seems to change.
That's right. And the Royal Commission completely and utterly ignored the fact that, there are in some remote communities in the Northern Territory, there are still promised marriages. There are still young girls being promised to older men to, become promised wives. And basically the excuse was that, well, it was not suggested by any of the people in the community that it was a problem, so we didn't think it was a problem, which means we're too lazy to go and investigate anything further, and we didn't want to upset the apple cart, because we didn't actually want to take a peek within what the factors might be within culture that are actually contributing to this, these levels of abuse. I mean, I've grown up understanding and knowing traditional cultural values as an Aboriginal woman. I've been taught that I must avoid any kind of men's business, because if I were to come across it, I can be punished, and my punishment can be a beating and can be sexual assault, and that is utterly acceptable. I know that in my own language there is no word for rape, and in many languages, Aboriginal languages, there is no actual word for that term. And traditionally, culturally, it's a misdemeanor in some cases if a man were to have his way with a teenage girl. If that girl is from the right kin category, then it's a misdemeanor. It's not a problem, even if it was against her will. And we are not yet ready to face any of this. And I mean, in many ways, having grown up in knowing my culture and being able to stand back and look at the aspects that I say to myself, you know what, I don't agree with this, and to be able to articulate those things across to other Australians to create better understanding is what needs to take place. There's a lot of romanticism that goes on with regard to traditional Aboriginal culture. But even people of Aboriginal descent don't necessarily understand, the ins and outs of traditional culture. And the literature is there. There's so much evidence there that basically describes the way in which Aboriginal women and children can be treated under customary law. We have a member of Parliament, Yingya Guila, who is a young member of Parliament who is trying to bring back elements of customary law to be recognised in Australian law, which I utterly disagree with, because I believe that as Australians, we should practice one law for all of us. And until, in terms of traditional law, we haven't gone through our systems and gone, what, that doesn't work for us. The fact that a man can beat his own wife for certain crimes, that we can't accept those sorts of things. There's if we don't recognise those elements within traditional Aboriginal culture that are contributing to the violence and the abuse, we are never going to actually start to resolve any of these issues. And that is what the Royal Commission most definitely utterly failed to recognise. As I mentioned, I think there are a lot of people in communities who feel there's a sense of it's the norm to suffer abuse. That is what they've grown up with. Earlier this year, there was a case I sat through where a 16-year-old distant relative of mine had been raped by her own father from the ages of 13 to 16, and her aunt took her to police to report what had happened to her, and as a result, he was arrested and it went to trial, and myself and my mother and father sat in there to support her. She had no other support aside from her aunt, who had helped her, and look, her 13-year-old cousin, who took the stand, whose first language is not English, who took the stand to give evidence when her own cousin had been raped in the same room as her by her father. And while the trial was taking place, her own grandmother, the victim's grandmother, was angry at the fact that her son, the rapist, was likely to be sentenced because of this, and so encouraged her other son to attack the victim's aunt, who had supported her through all of this, in her place of work, which was the primary school in the community, to retaliate against the fact that she had brought this to the attention of police and was there supporting her own granddaughter. So when you've got women in the family who are supporting the perpetrators, we've got a huge problem here. And unfortunately, that is not an isolated sort of scenario. This thing happens often. There was one case back up in the top end where the young 15-year-old her own grandmother had told her promised husband to take her, because she was becoming a rebellious teenager. It is thought that, well, if you allow the promised husband to take them and, basically do what they want with them. In this case, she was held against her own will and repeatedly raped out on the promised husband's, out on his outstation, held against her will. And that was encouraged by the grandmother. And this is traditional culture at work. And this is what, I get told when I talk about these issues, I get told I'm a sellout and I'm a coconut. How can you say this about your own people? I am speaking out for the sake of these victims. And in Western culture, we're spoiled, where we have the privilege of using constructive criticism to determine what elements of our culture are destructive for us and how we should change those in order to progress forward. There's this, because of this romanticism of Aboriginal culture, we're told we must remain this way because we have been as such for, now it's more than 60,000 years. There are those who are trying to say 100,000 years, if you like. So we must remain this way. But this is usually coming from people who don't live by traditional customary law, who don't promise their daughters off when they're babies and to older men, and then when they reach the age of 13, righto, you've got to go and live with your promised husband now, who's probably in his 50s. We've got to get real about these particular issues. We've really got to get real about them, because it's what's contributing to the high rates of incarceration, believe it or not. And we can't just simply do what the closing the gap measures are expecting us to do, and just trying to make sentences more lenient for perpetrators, or find diversionary programs. I would not agree at all for diversionary programs for pedophiles or women bashers. That's just absolutely absurd.
Well, that brings to the question, because there's this huge push about reducing incarceration rates. Myself, I believe that they're focusing on the wrong area. They should be focused. You know how you reduce incarceration rates? You actually look at reducing crime within communities. I just find this really, really frustrating when the bleeding obvious is sitting before our faces, and yet we get we get people who who come out like you do, and they get abused. And I've been abused and called these people are just evil. They're bigoted. They have no sense of protection of Aboriginal people, Aboriginal kids, Aboriginal women, Aboriginal men. They just let these things happen and continue to defend this type of behaviour, this criminal, crazy behaviour, and it just goes on and on. And you sort of also, I'm not just talking about Aboriginal people, I'm talking about the wider community too. What is the police and the justice system and the politicians doing, who should be protecting these people? I just feel, just so frustrated when you see and you read these stories, and you have to only look at the suicide rates with these young kids, getting kids who are 9 and 10, 11 and 12 committing suicide rates. It's just unbelievable. And in the background of that, the cases that have been brought up recently, it has been cause of sexual abuse. And you only have to go to the detention centres and you talk to some of the women in there, and a few of them are in there because of the results of childhood abuse, and then they go on and get into drugs and alcohol and all these other issues because of what's been done to them, and they all just and then end up in jail, and you just sort of go. So the real issue is about, let's get fair dinkum. Black Lives Matter. If you really care about Black lives, I don't think anything more important than children is in any society. I don't care what society it is. They're the future. They're what we are fighting for, and getting them educated and getting them into schools and getting them to build a life for themselves. And yet, we'll rather talk about some person who's died in custody. They had a heart attack, or police were chasing them and they fell in a river and drowned. We'll march for them. But how many other? But where is the marches for our children? Where are the marches for our kids? Where is the protection of our kids? And again, I'm not focusing on just Aboriginal people here. I'm talking about the whole system, the government system, the whole community system. Do we all just turn blind eyes to this and just let it continue? And just the Australian taxpayer pays a lot of money into Indigenous affairs because they want to see changes, and they're very generous with their money. Where is the huge amount of focus on this area?
Exactly. And again, you see far more sympathy and far more support for perpetrators of crimes than you do for victims, for victims of abuse, for victims who are our children. I mean, I've only seen people marching down the street with the number 435, those Black deaths in custody since the Royal Commission, and this false narrative behind it that somehow they're all a result of police brutality, and yet the the brutality toward our children from our own community members, from their own family members, is utterly and absolutely ignored. And I mean, another case up in the top end of a 17-year-old girl, she chose to deliberately sniff so that the services would remove her from the community that she was in. So they did that. And she told authorities when taken to Darwin that she would rather die than go back to the community of Yirrkala, where, you know, the wonderful Gama festival is held once a year, and where champagne socialists can pay big bucks to go and participate in, you know, Aboriginal culture, and yet utterly ignore the issues regarding the children. So this girl was sent back to that community, and they ignored the fact that she'd threatened to suicide, and she did. She took her life not long after, you know, going back to that community, because she again was a victim of sexual abuse and of rape, and no one there had the ability to support her through that. You know, I'm deputy mayor of the Alice Springs community, and right now our community is utterly suffering because of youth crime. And the Territory Families Minister, basically her excuse was, if you mention youth crime publicly, then you're demonising our youth. Well, that is an absolute lame excuse for not getting off your backside and doing something about the situation that our children are faced with. If children are committing crime, clearly their home lives are not working for them. I have people come to me on a regular basis with their concerns about kids. There's a woman who came to me who said an 8-year-old keeps coming to her house because her parents just aren't home. And if she is home, if the mother is home, she's sitting there smoking a bong. But the 8-year-old keeps coming to her house, and she's rung police, and the police have said, well, you know, if there's no one home, can she just stay at your place? And she's sort of been put on the spot, and she's, yeah, I guess so. I'll take this. I'll look after her until her parents are home. She's rung Territory Families, and who knows how many notifications have to be put forward in order for them to take any action. But they're not taking any action on this 8-year-old's situation. She even had a meeting at the school, and the principal put it back onto this particular woman and asked her several questions around, why haven't you done this and why haven't you done that? Remembering that this woman is just an acquaintance to this little girl, but because the little girl has identified her place as a safe place, she's always going there. And it's as if something really horrible has to happen to this 8-year-old for something to be done. But then again, we're seeing situations where there's notifications and where the authorities step in, but nothing really there's no action really taken. And this we know that we've got kids as young as 8 in our community doing break and enters. We had some teenagers steal a car just a few weeks back, and did a hit and run, and the poor bloke lost his life as a result. So because of this behaviour in our community, which, you know, obviously stems from these children having broken homes, there has to be abuse going on, because I don't know an Aboriginal person who hasn't suffered some kind of abuse in their life. And yet there is no leadership, certainly not in this Territory government, to actually step up and do anything about this situation. But Territory Families has had a culture of not taking action to protect these children, and this idea that, you know, no, they've got to stay they've got to stay on country. This is a favourite saying. They've got to keep them on country and keep them connected to their culture and their language, and yet their culture and their language is in utter dysfunction.
Yeah, well, you got to wonder what sort of culture and that they're learning when and we've seen the cases come out, cases after cases after case. Like with that 5-year-old kid who was sexually abused by 13 and 14-year-olds, and the best thing they come up with, we'll change the law and we'll make that you can't take criminal action against kids 14 years and younger, and I think that's just totally friggin' bizarre. What are they going to do that actually resolves these issues? And look, my belief is that we've got to have a proper, sensible conversation about this. And as I said, the whole Australian community has to take responsibility for this, because we've all sat back and watch this happen and happen again and happen again and happen again. And it's getting, and you got to just say, can't believe this stuff, So how do we, how do we start fixing some of this stuff? To me, it's the mainstream media, tends to just write a story and then forget about it. The government's sort of, they like to be heroes in running around like Malcolm Turnbull did and call that Royal Commission. And what happened to it? I said at the very beginning, and this is where I had my first fight with him. Well, at the very beginning, all you're going to do is spend $50 million, and you're going to come up with recommendations that isn't going to change anything. And guess what? I was wrong in the $50 million. It was $52 million they actually spent. And you've got to, they would have been better that you spent that $52 million on actually real community-based dealing with these issues and changing the law. I look at that coroner's report, and where the coroner report comes out and just damns them, and they should be damned in regard to what has happened to these kids. And they've got to look at why kids are suiciding. Why are they suicide? And then you don't have to be a rocket science to work that out. And you see the community, you see the backgrounds of these things, and it just So look, the first thing I'd like is, okay, let's see.
I'm sorry. I think I've okay. If I seem to be working, all right. Yeah. Look, I think that what's really important is, because of the Royal Commission into Black Deaths in Custody, what we've seen courts not wanting to be seen as being racist. So, Aboriginal perpetrators are less likely to receive longer sentences. And I think when it comes to, sometimes I think drug dealers get longer sentences than what child abusers get. And I think it's utterly wrong. If we want to deter pedophiles from abusing children, then they should get rather lengthy sentences, as far as I'm concerned, and they should not receive bail because they're potentially putting communities back at risk. Victims and victims' families do not want to have to put up with seeing the faces of perpetrators around their communities. And the other thing is, I think the whole child protection system in all states probably needs complete overhaul. I mean, I think Western Australia are putting more measures in place and dealing with putting together a task force, have put together a task force around child protection. And I think I think certainly in the Northern Territory families needs to be there needs to be a royal commission into child protection in terms of, in all the states, but particularly in the Northern Territory, it needs to be determined what sort of culture is going on within Territory families for children to have to receive up to 50 plus notifications for anything to actually be done to protect them. I believe that we should be able to, it's like there's a second lot of laws for Aboriginal people and Aboriginal children, which I think is absolutely racist. These are Australian citizens, and we all need to be treated as such. Yes. The foster care system most certainly needs to be overhauled. I'm well aware of the fact that in some cases, some foster carers have been worse for the children than their own circumstances. Yeah. So there needs to be an understanding of who these foster carers are, but also when it comes to Aboriginal kids, the first thing shouldn't be that you just, automatically stick these kids back out into their community because they need to be on country and connected to culture and connected to language. Because I know of circumstances where there's been Aboriginal children in foster care, some of which who have special needs issues like autism, Asperger's. They've got learning difficulties and those sorts of things, and they need to be near where the services are available to them. But even against the advice of pediatricians, of child psychologists, I have seen Territory families put children back out into remote communities where those services are not available to them for their development, because they found someone who's connected by kin. And I also know of people who put their hand up to be kin carers because there is a good deal of money involved in being a carer as well. I know that that's certainly the case too. So the system needs to be considered all the way through, but I think there should be more opportunity for children and in foster care to be adopted into families that are actually going to give the long-term stability that they need to be rounded, healthy adults. Because I think as long as we're looking after them through childhood, once they reach adulthood, they can find out more about who they are and what their background is. But there's no point shoving a kid back into an environment that's going to lead them down the path to suicide. We want to save our children. And Australia is one of the toughest countries in terms of adoption. And I don't think it should be that way. I don't think it should be that way at all. And there shouldn't be discrimination about a carer's ethnic background, whether they're white, black, brindle. I think it should come down to the fact that they're caring, loving, stable human beings that can offer that child, that can uphold the rights of that child, no matter what their background is.
Look, you're 100% right there. How criminal it is for these people to put these kids back into those dangerous situations. It is just mind-boggling. You would never, ever in your own common sense brain actually say, okay, you've been abused here, so we're just going to leave you there and put you back in there, in that position. That is just complete insanity. I just cannot believe that we have been doing this as a society. And you do raise the most important point, is that these are our fellow Australians. We are all Australians here. We deserve have the protection of the law and protection of the court systems and the family care systems and that, just like any other Australian does. And it has to have that care. And it's about time that we started doing these things in a proper way. And I do agree with adoptions as well, if they're going to be looked after and cared for, because people, these days, they do, if they have an Aboriginal kid, they do encourage them and do work with them to have that connection with their culture and with their language and stuff like that. This is not the 1920s anymore. This is not the 1930s. Here we are in the 21st century, and we're letting people get away with murder. That's how we can start saying it. Getting away with murder, getting away with abuse of children, and the society is letting them do it. I just, it's about time that these governments actually got some balls and actually did the job that they were supposed to do. They are elected there to build a good economy for their state or territory. They're elected there to protect the citizens of those states or territory, and they need to be doing something. And if it takes a royal commission into the whole system, the whole bloody system, then let's do it, and let's have it opened, and let's have people come in. We just did it with the child abuse stuff in regard to the institutional child abuse, and I just found it quite funny that that here was this investigation into the institutional child abuse. What happened? What about the Aboriginal kids? What about all those kids who have been taken away into those some of those foster homes and that? What about those kids who are still in their communities? We know statistically that child abuse happens more within the community that you're living in and within the family. And it doesn't matter whether you're black, white, green, pink, or purple. That's just the fact. So we need to actually, how do we get out there and start, getting these people to do their bloody job. Surely you are being paid taxpayers' money. You're being elected to do something. Get off your ass and actually stop fiddling with your thumbs and actually do something.
Absolutely. And, in terms of a lot of these remote communities, it's about fixing those communities. It's about ensuring, I think, education is so important, and not just for kids. I think parents need to be educated. There's a Safe for Kids program, which is run in a lot of remote communities, and the wonderful woman who runs it, she works with the children in those communities, but she also works with adults, because quite often adults in these remote communities don't realize or understand that allowing kids to watch pornography is not on. It's not acceptable. And it might be because of these adults, this was a norm for them at some stage in their life, perhaps even in their childhood. But I think because there's this fear of speaking up and speaking about some of these issues, a lot of outsiders just don't do it. I mean, you've got health workers in remote communities who feel threatened if they were to speak up about, young people being abused in those communities. They don't speak up. There's a code of silence that exists within the public service when it comes to Indigenous issues. They need to be sorted out. You're not doing anyone any favours. You're not doing the adults any favours. You're not doing the children any favours if there's no level of honesty, and if there's no, if there's also not an avenue to be able to bring forward these issues in some of the communities and report them and feel safe to do so, then they go unreported as well. And that cannot continue to happen. I mean, I know in some communities, you get some elders and there are people in housing that work with these elders, and they themselves might be behind 10 years in rent, but the people working in housing keep their mouth shut because this particular person is a powerful person in that community. I mean, if it's to do with rent, who knows what they're keeping their mouth shut about when it comes to issues of child abuse and those sorts of things. But everyone knows, and anyone who's ever worked in a remote community, who's ever worked in the public service in a remote community or health in a remote community, they know exactly what I'm talking about when it comes to that code of silence. And people are scared to speak out because of their, loss of their own jobs, because of possible threats that are made toward them. But government agencies should not at all be ensuring that code of silence exists. They should not be doing that, and more needs to be done. That's what's going to help victims in these communities, along with education, along with employment opportunities. Welfare has exacerbated this problem so much more than I believe, it was prior to welfare coming into this system. And while there are elements of culture that I know contribute to levels of abuse and cover up to, if you like, I know that there have been those perpetrators who have tried to use culture as an excuse also to perpetrate, which is utterly wrong. And there have been laws that are put in place to change that, to ensure that a perpetrator, that when a judge is sentencing a perpetrator, that they aren't to take into account customary law when delivering a sentence, which I think is great. And I know that the member for Arnhem, Yingia Gwila, tried to have that overturned. He claimed for other reasons, for example, being able to, for example, if a young person were to be found selling dope in a community, that the sentencing might involve a diversionary program where they go back to the elders to be sorted out. But you don't know what that could lead to and the way in which that could be taken advantage of in those situations. So again, I believe in one law for all Australians, and we should all fall under that. And we need to revisit laws that have created more lenient sentences for Indigenous perpetrators. Laws that came about because of the Royal Commission into Black Deaths in Custody. Because again, as you said, we do need a Royal Commission into Indigenous family violence and child sexual abuse. We absolutely need that, and we need to take everything into account, and we need to be prepared. We need to be able to bring in the fold victims and allow them to have a voice which protects them, which protects their identity, and keeps them safe, but have the opportunity to speak openly and honestly about what they've been, confronted with in their experiences.
And it's like it's the silent, the voice of the innocent who is being crushed here and not being heard. We should be talking about all the names, and this is what we should do. We'll do this next time, is get of all these people who have been killed. In that time period, they talk about the 432 or 37 people who were killed in custody, and let's be honest, a lot of them weren't killed. They died of natural causes and everything like that. Is that over 1,000 Indigenous people were murdered in that time frame? Murdered. What about those deaths?
And 765 of those were murdered by other Aboriginal people.
Yeah. So where is look, all these people, they like to big note themselves. They like to come out and get on marches and say, oh, we care about Black people, or we care. Well, what about those innocent voices? What about those it's not our statistics, it's the statistics that are coming out of the criminology and all that. The double-digit figures about women who suffer violently, and kids who are suffering, and suicide rates, and yet these people just seem to be comfortable about that. I just find that gut-wrenching and quite sick. And then these people will get on Twitter, these troll heroes, and they'll say, well, you're just a coconut, you're the king and queen of Coconut Island, and that. And I say, well, you're just a bigoted racist because you consider Aboriginal people, Aboriginal children, as less important to anyone else because you're not going to do anything about it.
Exactly. And for those who have tried to suggest that I exploit, Aboriginal victims of violence and sexual abuse of children, I'm exploiting them for some crazy personal gain that I might get, I think that's an utter cop-out, and it's disgusting. And you should be working with me to tackle this particular issue instead of trying to silence me. Those young girls up in the top end, we should remember their names: Fionica Yarangan, Lagi James, Katura Sherilyn Mamarika, Layla Gullum Leering, and of course Annalise Ugal from Western Australia. They're the names that we should be shouting about, that we should be walking down the street with placards for. And that, because they are the name, it's not just them, it's so many more behind them, and continuing to suffer to this day, that we need to continue to fight on behalf of.
100% correct, and I'm glad you said their names there, because these are the names we should remember. These are the people we should be fighting for those kids, for their justice, that and how they were treated, and that. I just find it quite bizarre that why aren't we doing this more often? Why aren't we really calling people to account for not doing their jobs? One the Minister for Indigenous Australians, Ken Wyatt, has called for an audit. Well, I hope he really, in regard to that audit, I hope he really digs down into those organisations, into those government departments, and that were supposed to be looking after these kids, who are supposed to be caring for them and showing them love and decency, and that they actually get out there and start doing it. And we shouldn't be, and they should not be letting people get away with this. I get sick and tired of some of this stuff. Like, they ring me up and they want to talk about the flag, and they ring me up and they want to talk about the anthem. They ring me up, like those footballers. They got out in the middle of the ground there and said they don't want to sing the national anthem because it's racist. Well, why don't they get out in the ground there and say we're not going to sing the song because these kids are being killed in our communities?
Exactly. Why don't you prioritize, what's important? Upholding the human rights of our children should be the number one priority. And again, if we're to actually tackle these particular issues, then we will see a knock-on effect. We will see levels of incarceration reducing. We will see youth crime dropping. We might actually see more kids finishing their education. We might see more adults being employed. It all goes hand in hand. The trauma and the suffering has to stop.
It does, and we need to get it fixed as quickly as possible, because I just really angry, and really can't believe that within a few more weeks we'll probably have the same issue come up again and again and again and again and again, and governments come out and go, oh, this is terrible, and cry crocodile tears and all this, and all these Aboriginal leaders will then blame, oh, it's colonisation. Well, colonisation, you can't change history. What we've got to do is fix things now and into the future. You can't, just white it out of a history book. It's just a fact. It's something that happened, and we need to move forward. And if you look at and I always look at the Jewish community in regard to this, because they went through the Holocaust, and within 2 years after the Holocaust, they set up the state of Israel, and they got doctors and lawyers and scientists and school teachers and generals and politicians. They got all these amazing people and business leaders and technology and that to move forward. And yet all we hear from these so-called people out there who are the experts, and they sit there and go, well, it was colonisation, we need to decolonise the country. Well, I hope they got a re-housing plan for overseas, because there's something like 26 million other people living in this country, and we're all getting on quite well, and we need to stop dividing us, stop listening to that critical race theory where, oh, if you're black, you're oppressed, and no matter what happens in your life. What's that teaching our kids? It's teaching our kids, just give up. Don't get educated. don't do anything because you're black, and that's it. You know, that's the end of your life. We got to stop that nonsense, stop that bigotry, and stop that stupidity. I'll just leave the last word for you, Jacinta, before we close up.
Yeah, look, I think the whole colonization and racism excuse is a cop-out, is an absolute cop-out. If anything, those that are the most marginalized in this country do have their language. They are still connected to culture. They are the least colonized. So that cannot be used as an excuse anymore. And it's time for their voices to be heard. It's high time that our leaders stop trying to be all things to everyone and stop trying to please everyone. We need to bring back the kind of leadership that Tony Abbott had, the kind of leadership that Howard had, where when they said they were going to do something, they'd go ahead and do it, and they'd take issues like this seriously because they recognised that Aboriginal Australians were Australian citizens like everybody else. And as for people like Kevin Rudd, who's obviously closing the gap policy has continued to fail, who keeps slamming the Murdoch press. Well, it's the Murdoch press who continually, Amos Aikman at The Australian has for years highlighted this issue. He doesn't stop. It's like the only issue he reports on. And if you want to shut down the Murdoch press, then you might as well silence these victims out in remote communities, because I sure as hell don't see The Guardian or other papers like that, the mainstream media, nor the ABC actually getting off their backsides to prioritise these sorts of issues. They're interested in ideology, they're interested in Black Lives Matter, the movement, and not the lives of innocent children whose human rights are not being upheld because, you know, everyone else is telling them that it's their culture and their language that's more important than their actual human rights. Enough of this nonsense. It has to stop.
Yes, you're 100% right there, Jacinta. Well, that comes to the conclusion of our show. If you want to help us produce more content like tonight's show and my Mundine Means Business series, join my Facebook support group. For less than a cup of coffee, you can become a monthly subscriber and help me get my message out there and help Jacinta get her message out there. And if you go to our Facebook page, you'll see the next up and coming webinars. And I thank you for tonight. And I definitely thank you, Jacinta, and I thank the background crew who has helped us put on tonight's show. So good night.